I'm going to turn it over to Professor Siegel for introductions.
Okay, well, thanks very much. We have 6 great panelists. Starting off with my own colleague, Professor Usman. And all I'll say about Professor Bloom is, before I really knew very much about academic support, I read something early that she wrote concerning Bloom's taxonomies, and I thought, wow, it takes a certain amount of chutzpah to kind of name a taxonomy after yourself and then write about it as if this has already been acknowledged. And not surprisingly, she does have that, but it's all well-founded, and I subsequently realized that there was another Bloom involved. So,
That's actually a funny story, because recently another of our colleagues sent me an email saying, oh, I was just reading, and I saw this Bloom's taxonomy. Wow, well done. Different Bloom. So anyway, I want to start just by talking a little bit about how this article builds, because actually, having heard so many presentations today, I feel that a lot of my writing touches on different areas that people have spoken about, and so maybe I can try to put some of these concepts together in a different way. So we've heard a lot today about self-regulated learning and metacognition, and in the learning context, this just means having students really take responsibility for their own learning, figuring out the task that needs to be accomplished, how they're going to go about completing that task, and then really evaluating. And if something doesn't make sense to them, figuring out how they're going to figure it out. Do they need to go back and talk to the professor? Do they need to go back and look at readings? What do they need to do to help them learn it? And what goes hand in hand with this is really the ability to learn how to self-assess. And working in this field of formative assessment and feedback, I realized quickly as I started trying to convince all of my colleagues that this is what we needed to be doing, that it's not enough to give students feedback. We need to teach them how to use it. So this led to an article where the goal of my paper was really to have professors think about using formative assessment and feedback to enable self-regulated learning. And to address some of the comments that have been made by folks here today, what I was trying to do was to convince professors that we can have the students do the heavy lifting themselves. We can give feedback in a variety of ways that are not taking away from our time as much, if we can create ways for students to work with rubrics and model answers and charts that we create to help them assess. And then I find what becomes really valuable about that experience is that when the student comes into my office, I am not telling her what she did right and what she did wrong. I'm saying to her, I have this very complete assessment that the student, so this means the student has had to spend the time really engaging in the process, both substantive and structurally, of what it was that her answer should have looked like. And then I'm able to say to her, okay, it looks like you did a really good job of spotting issues and recognizing that you spotted the issues. Your rule statements were complete. It looks to me like your analysis was really lacking, but when I look at what you said about your work, you don't seem to have recognized that you missed all of these really important areas of substance. And then we're able to have a conversation where we're on the same page, and it's not that just kind of blank stare. And for the students in the room, I'm sure that you all know what I'm talking about when you go and talk to a professor and you're trying to get answers and they're saying things and you're not really sure what they mean, but you don't want to tell them you don't know what they mean, so you're just kind of smiling. And everybody's wasting their time, right? It's not the best way to go about it. So, and I also think that this point speaks to conversations we've had over the course of the day about who formative assessment is helping. Is it helping the students at the top of the class, or is it helping the students at the bottom of the class? And I get frustrated when folks say, well, only the top students can use self-assessment forms and rubrics to evaluate their own performance because they have the metacognition skills and the lower performing students don't have them. My response to that is, well then let's teach the lower performing students the metacognition skills, and then they can rise to the top. And so that led to my current article. And in this article, I do three things. I am talking about what students are doing, the common mistakes students make versus what they should be doing to learn. And then I make the connection to the ABA that we've talked about in a million different ways today already. And then I talk about how to engage in backwards course design, and I use the specific example of an evidence class. I talk about how you might have a specific learning outcome and go through the various formative assessment methods you would use to ensure that your learning objectives are met. So in terms of what students are doing versus what they should be doing to learn, this is where James McGrath has already introduced us to a lot of cognitive science principles. You should know that James and I have this thing going where we show up at conferences and end up presenting on the same thing. So it's really just a matter of who gets to go first. But he won today. But I was thinking about his multiple choice question on his slide, where we had all those options of the best way to really drill a concept home. And as you recall, the correct answer was like, do it and then wait 2 days and then do it again. Feels like we've been here 2 days, right? So we're gonna do it again. I'm gonna just go through, thank you, James, you and I. So essentially, I'm not gonna repeat what James said, but I just wanna maybe fill in some areas in more detail. In terms of why learning must be challenging, the real, kind of one of the other components is that it helps students embrace the two main components of successful learning, which are retention and transfer. And retention is being able to remember and demonstrate that specific skill learned, and then transfer is being able to execute that skill in a new situation. Active learning is critical. We heard about the passive techniques that students tend to use, rereading, instead of engaging in active learning activities such as self-testing. And as James said, rereading is especially problematic because you think you're mastering it, but you're really just becoming more familiar with the text on the page. So one other thing that I wanted to fill in is that in my article, I look at a lot of the studies showing the common mistakes made by students in various educational settings. And how many of you have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? Show of hands. We've got some hands. Basically, there are these inaccuracies in your predicted versus your actual academic performance, and these are even more pronounced in lower performing students, which I think also goes to this same issue of needing to teach metacognition. The reality is that in order to have the skills necessary to assess the metacognition skills, if you don't have them, you're not as competent, but then as you develop the skills needed to evaluate competence, you're actually becoming competent. So they really go hand in hand. So I look at these studies and, same general principles. We need to distribute this learning over time. And all of this is explained by schema theory, which is, this notion that we learn things by making connections between the concepts that we already know, and then we learn new things and we put them in our existing schema, or we have to create new ones as required. And we know that this is especially important in law school because all of these concepts are building on each other. So what are we going to do? The hope is that we transform our students into self-regulated learners who embrace desirable difficulties. Desirable difficulties, complex learning activities that require students to actively engage with the material in numerous ways to promote these self-assessment and reflection skills, metacognition. And while this process might initially seem to slow the rate of learning, By challenging students in this way, it makes us, they have to develop their own strategies to address these intricate tasks. So they identify the discrepancy between what they're learning and the prior knowledge, and they have to stop and come up with new strategies to resolve the confusion and figure out where to put that new information. So from here in my article, I transition to standards 3, 14, and 15 and talk about the learning outcomes and the formative assessment and everything that we've talked about already. But just a couple build-ons here. This is something that I've used with my faculty, a way to get us to start thinking about how we can design courses that put desirable difficulties into the process, but also put in the formative assessments and help us think about the learning outcomes, starting with your learning objectives for the course, figuring out what summative assessment and formative assessments you're going to use, and then designing your class accordingly, essentially, how you're going to teach the class and how you're going to assess the learning. And so my article concludes with a very specific example to try to take you through the process of how this might occur. So in the evidence context, I create a very simple learning outcome for one very concrete portion of evidence, basically identifying the permitted use of crimes, wrongs, or other acts under Federal Rule 404B as non-character theories of relevance, their interaction with 403, and the mechanics required for introduction. And essentially, in this scenario, you would imagine that the assessment measure would be a question on an exam. And then I go through all of the different formative assessment exercises you as a professor might introduce for your students to ensure that they would be able to perform on this specific learning outcome. And again here, everything you see up here is something that somebody has talked about today in some capacity. We have our practicing multiple choice questions. In terms of being able to use these to build self-assessment and reflection skills, I've created grids for my students, different types of grids. So I have the grid they use when they're practicing multiple choice questions, where they have the ability for each answer choice to be able to, identify whether they think it's right or wrong and why, so that you come to the correct decision. And then, the space for the take-home message, once you've gone back and figured out the answer, whether you got it right or wrong, and what your take-home message is, what you have learned from that exercise, why you chose the wrong answer, and it always comes back to demonstrating to students that a multiple choice question is no different than IRAC on an essay. You're identifying the issue, you're picking the rule, you're analyzing, you're coming to your conclusion, and you should be able to identify exactly where you are in your outline. Down to the concept, subconcept. We've also done multiple choice creation, and here's where I introduce Bloom's taxonomy. Again, not mine. And what I've found is that when I give students a basic education in the cognitive aspect of the Bloom taxonomy, and they're then creating questions where at the same time they're thinking about what level they're testing in terms of whether, this is just knowledge and comprehension, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. So we spend a whole class talking about this. And again, this goes to what folks have said earlier today about getting some, buy-in for the strategies that we're employing. I think it helps when students feel that we are making conscious decisions about what we're teaching them. We also work on creating visual organizers. There was a whole portion in my article as well about learning styles and the fact that it's not about teaching students learning styles, but teaching them metacognition, because we all have to operate in every learning style. But I do like to model for students making sense of information in a variety of ways that would appeal to all the different learning styles. So with something like the Rule 404B and the way it interacts with 403, this is an area where if students can create a visual organizer that helps them see, and the evidence book that my students use actually has a lot of visual components to it with roots around the propensity box, and it helps students make sense of that in a different way if they can create some sort of a flow chart. And again, what I've learned is giving them the flow chart is not going to get me anywhere, because that's how I've made sense of the material. The students have to make sense of it in their own way. It's the same reason why, a student will not do well on an exam and they don't understand why, because they had the outline of the student who got the straight A. If it's not your outline, it's not going to help you in the same way. And then, your classic essay practice. And again, I provide very detailed rubrics for my students, and every time we do any sort of a formative assessment exercise, there's always a worksheet that I've created very carefully in which they are answering very specific questions about process and product, having to compare to a model answer, having to pull away take-home points, similar to the, exit ticket to the room, what did you learn today? And what I find is that, when you really encourage students to engage in this way, they come to you with different types of questions, and they've done the work required to actually engage in a conversation in which you'll be helpful to them. So I want to conclude by returning to the coverage issue that some folks have mentioned when doctrinal faculty say, I just don't have time. I have all this material I have to cover, and I can't put in all of this extra stuff. And I think that what I'm recommending is not a change in what we're teaching our students, it's just more a change in how we're teaching them. And my article concludes with 2 possible examples, depending on whether folks decide to buy in or not. If we don't introduce all of these formative assessment opportunities, we end up with a student who makes that classic Dunning-Kruger mistake. They've been, engaging in the methodologies that lead to the illusion of understanding, the rereading, the highlighting, the cramming. They wait till it's too late in the semester, they meet with you, and now you have a lot you need to do to help that student. It is going to be very time-consuming. If you spend a little time on the front end of it to help build those self-regulated learning skills and to promote self-assessment, you now have a student who's engaged in all of these exercises, has put in the work already, and when they come and sit down and meet with you, they don't need that much from you. They have very specific questions. They're asking for, resource suggestions, and ultimately this is going to lead to better teaching, better learning, and is also complying with these new ABA regulations that we all have to comply with. All right, that's it.
Julie, we just asked him.
Pardon me?
The title of your paper, I said, we just asked him.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't realize there was going to be so many students here. This is great. I've got a quick handout. I'm not sure if I've really got enough copies for everyone here. Thank you. So what I'm talking about this afternoon will be very brief, very informal, and far more anecdotal than academic. We have heard a lot about formative assessment today, the what, the why, the how, and so forth, and also really fantastic ideas. But what I've been asked specifically to speak on is just what students think about formative assessment. So we may hear from some of the students here today. What I've passed out here is I can't take credit for this. I borrowed this from a Professor Parrish at Washington University in St. Louis, and what it is it's a midterm learning reflection. And so just briefly, if you have a look at the questions that are involved, is that we're not asking students what they like. because sometimes we get those very vague answers of, oh, I liked that, that was boring. We wanted to get at rather what is helping them learn. And so that was the idea behind this midterm learning reflection. And also it's incorporating, some of the concepts that we've heard of metacognition and, learning about how you learn and so forth. And so really the purpose here was first to invite students to reflect on their learning and development, but also to provide valuable insight to me about the effects of the methods that I've been using. And so you'll notice that on the midterm reflection that this wasn't directed solely at formative assessment, that there are several aspects of the course that are listed in the first question. What I've done for our formative assessment discussion today is to break out the aspects that relate to formative assessment from this midterm reflection. And the aspects that I've identified are the quizzes, the mini assignments, written feedback, and one-on-one conferences. And just so that you understand what was entailed here, I'm just going to give you a little brief background of what these might involve. So our quizzes, they might be based on foundational concepts like court hierarchy, might be based on assigned reading. So for example, court hierarchy, would this decision be binding in this court? So obviously a foundational, I teach first year legal research and writing, so obviously a very foundational concept for the course. As far as mini assignments, so for those of you, there's many in the legal writing world here today, this might be a research report. So as we're engaging in a new assignment, I might have the students report to me what they've identified as the most appropriate authority so far. Obviously to make sure they've started on the assignment, that we're researching the right jurisdiction, that we're researching the right issue, and have we uncovered some useful cases so far. It might be a chunk of the analysis, give me an IRAC, or I might break that down to provide me with a rule and an application, or might break that down even further, and this is what I've been getting into a little bit more lately, provide me with a rule explanation and a case illustration on one particular topic. So those are some examples of what the mini assignments might be like. And then there's the feedback, and these typically come from the mini assignment, so it would be the written feedback. So I've had the students turn in the assignment to me, and then I sit down and I go through and I make comments. I will try and diagnose what an issue is and perhaps provide some suggestions for how to resolve it. So it takes me some time to do this, and then our oral feedback is the conferences. So again, the folks that are from the legal writing world here are very familiar with our conferences that sit down. I will read through the students' mini assignment first, and then we'll sit down and chat about it. And instead of me trying to figure out what the student was getting at, we can engage in this conversation. And so here's the very quick details. So not, like I said, very formal. It's my quasi-empirical study. I've done it for the last 2 semesters, and so it involves a total of 54 students. So again, not a huge sample size, so take that if you will. And just a couple of things that I would note. When I did it last fall, I gave it to the students to complete in class. And this semester I was a little bit wiser, and I gave the questions to the students to complete at home and return to the next class. And I say wiser because I feel like I got more thoughtful, a little bit more detailed responses, rather than just giving them a few minutes in class to work on this. So here's the outcome. Here's sort of the broad strokes, what students found. And again, I stress that it's not the preferences. It's what we were trying to get at here was what the students perceive to be most helpful to their learning. So I don't think a lot of surprises here. The mini assignments, the written feedback, one-on-one conferences, and the quizzes. So let me ask the folks here. Let's start with the professors first. When you think about the assessment techniques that you use, what do you think are the ones that are most useful to you? Do folks think that quizzes? Yeah.
problem sets.
Okay. And by problem sets, the students will be working on what?
So I use a problems-based casebook, and so we talk about the problems in class, but I actually have students turn in written answers to the problems as well, periodically throughout the semester, and so that allows me to figure out, are they actually paying attention in class, understanding the material, able to articulate it back. Ideally, they prepare the written problems before discussion and then update them afterwards.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in? Yeah.
I find Quaker quizzes really helpful, but I do them really straight up doctrine, and I don't have the students graded, but I can see, do 80% of them get this basic question? Do 90? Is it more like 50? Is it 20?
Right.
And then I can focus on that. It's usually helpful. I've heard back from them. It's helpful.
Okay, and I agree. I don't use the clicker quizzes, but I do use the quizzes. So the example that I used was the court hierarchy, so that I know if the majority of the students, got a decent score on this quick quiz, then we've got a good handle on it. If the majority of students get a lower score on this quiz, then I know I need to circle back, and I'm going to spend another class, or at least a portion of the class, talking about this to make sure that everyone's grasped this important concept. So I would put on there that quizzes, I think, are most helpful to me. I'd be interested to hear from the students. So none of these students, I don't think, are any of the students that I had quizzed. So let's hear what your feedback is. What have you found? Oh, I've got some former students here, though. One, yep.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think quizzes are the most helpful, at least for me, but also not just like the quiz itself, but going back to the quiz afterwards and giving the right answers, but also giving the explanations to the right answers.
Okay.
Yeah, I like quizzes, but I think my favorite would be the mini assignments, because if they're engaging, you put in a lot of effort. If you find them interesting, if they're made to be fun, then students will get involved with that. But if they're kind of not well thought out, then you end up just kind of going through the motions. But if it's engaging and fun, interactive mini assignment, you can put in the effort, and that makes you learn.
Okay, excellent. Good, thank you. And I guess I should point out that the mini assignments, if we're talking about are they engaging, the mini assignments that I typically have are the steps that are needed to get to our final graded assignment. So I think, your point is well taken, that it's not just busy work, that it's something that's meaningful, perhaps. So here's what the outcome was. So the most helpful, according to the students in my last 2 semesters, I'll put that caveat out there, that 74%, so this is, of course, out of 54 students, thought that the mini assignments and the written feedback were the most helpful to their learning. I don't think there's any surprise here. I've just jotted down a few of the comments that these types of assignments are helpful. They assist in broadening our understanding of instructions and expectations before embarking on the graded assignment. So as I said, these are the pieces, the chunks that are necessary to get to our full final graded assignment. Written feedback, when students say it's particularly helpful, it gives us a check-in on if we are making good progress so far and what to focus on as we head into the graded assignment. So kind of what I was hoping to accomplish in doing the small mini assignments. Next, then, I say a close second because it's 67%, but the fact that there were only 54 students, it was just a couple of students less, preferred, or I guess I shouldn't say preferred, found the one-on-one conferences to be helpful. So students had said it was helpful to get immediate feedback on my work. I like having a two-way conversation with you about the problem rather than just reading the comments. I could ask for clarity on the comments when I wasn't sure what you meant, and then I could ask follow-up questions to figure out where to go from there. So again, I was encouraged by this result. And then finally, and this is what was most surprising to me, was that quizzes, 4%. And because, as I said, those I find most helpful. I can easily assess whether students are grasping whatever concept it is that we're after. And unfortunately, I think it was the 3 lonely souls who ticked off quizzes as being helpful did not give any comments. So I guess perhaps, that the act of studying for the quiz and then writing the quiz and then hearing what the right answer was, but we don't have any comments or insights why. So I was quite shocked by 4%. Oops, wrong way, sorry. So a couple of other observations. In that I was surprised that a handful of students, I didn't jot down how many, had indicated that they wanted to have a grade on it, and which is kind of interesting because it's meant to be formative assessment, being able to get feedback before you're graded on it. So I was a little surprised at that. And so one of the things that I do is I use the Lisa McElroy, the folks in the legal writing community would know the attorney mastery scale, which is mastery, developing mastery, or needs development. And so I thought that was useful to give students kind of a check-in as to where you stand. But now I've sort of buckled to this, and I have assigned a couple of points for each category there, just so we've got the number that students seem to be craving. And so a couple of things, another takeaway, so the methods that are most useful for our purposes, like I said, the quizzes I find most useful for my purpose, aren't necessarily perceived by students. Some students get it, but aren't necessarily perceived as the most helpful for students. So, the thought is, well, do away with the quizzes? No, absolutely not. I mean, of course, I'm still going to use quizzes, but I think that I could perhaps do a better job of, explaining the benefits, the, metacognition benefits that go into the quizzes for students. And again, this isn't meant to drive, what sorts of formative assessment we are undertaking, just give us some perspective on how they're being received. The other thing that struck me was that I always sort of wonder, just like we were talking about during conferences, there's a lot of nodding that goes on, and I sort of always wondered, are students really getting what we're talking about there? I know I've had students say in the past, it all made so much sense when we were talking in your office, and then I went home and I sat down, and then I'm staring at the blank screen again, And so I was sort of curious about how helpful the oral feedback was for students. And I think the takeaway for me is that I'm probably going to incorporate some more one-on-one conferences. As I said, the legal writing folks have long known about, and have long incorporated, and in fact are required to incorporate one-on-one conferences with students. But given that it's immediate feedback to the students, it's far less time-consuming for me to come and sit and meet with a student and have this conversation than for me to go through all of the assignments, type up detailed written feedback, written comments, and if students, for the most part, find it as helpful, I'm probably going to shift the focus to be more one-on-one conferences than the written feedback. I'll continue to do our midterm reflection and see if that's still the preference for students. And finally, the final takeaway is that what's good for our students is also good for us too. So by checking in the midterm of the semester, inviting and asking our students to reflect on their learning, we can also reflect on our teaching. And so I put this to you that our little midterm learning reflection could be a formative assessment for us. So we can check in and partway through the semester, see how our teaching and our development is going, and make the necessary corrections for the rest of the semester. So, thank you.
So we have a less uplifting topic to start with. Hopefully it'll get more uplifting towards the end. In your presentation, you said something that I actually wrote down. Outcomes matter, even the negative ones. We're starting with some negative outcomes. Some studies that show, these are studies from the 90s, often cited, about the problem of mental health in law school. Levels of clinical depression before law school, this study showed, were about 8%, which is about regular what the population is. By graduation, they were about 40%. In the legal profession, we have the highest incident of any occupation, up to 15 times greater, of mental health problems, including substance abuse, depression, and other mental health problems. Same with problematic alcohol use. About 18% of attorneys, and again, this is a 1990 study, compared to about 10% of general population, so almost doubled. Is it still true? This study suggests yes. 2016 study, often referred to as a Hazelton study, done by the ABA and Betty Ford Foundation. You can read the specific statistics, but as you can see, it's still about 18% for problematic alcohol use. And drinking and mental health problems still occur at a rate much higher than other populations. So the problem is still there. And sometimes we think of physicians as perhaps having similar stresses in their jobs. It turns out physicians actually have substance abuse problems and disorders at a rate similar to the general population, unlike lawyers, which is higher than the general population. And in case you want more bad news, here's another recent study. This one's specific to law students. The Hazelton study was lawyers, not law students. In this Duke University study, basically the same kinds of results. What's interesting about this Duke study is it shows that there's a marked decrease in happiness starting in law school, increasing as you practice, as you're longer in practice, until there's a slight increase when there's a move towards partnership, and then back to pre-law school levels are leaders in the legal profession. But here's the kick. About 40,000 lawyers per year leave the profession. And we graduated, or at least in 2009, we were graduating classes of about 40,000. So the question is, are a lot of people not ever getting back to their pre-law school levels of happiness? Okay, that's all the bad news. And then it makes us question, of course, what are we doing to that, right? What is the problem? Why is this happening? And if it starts in law school, is it connected to law school? And there are a lot of theories on the why. And I say theories, and there's a question, because we don't have a lot of empirical data to support whether these theories are correct or not, whether there's a cause here. Some of the theories, a lot of the theories, really focus around extrinsic motivations. Whether in law school, you start to develop extrinsic as opposed to intrinsic motivations, and whether that's connected to a loss of happiness. So things like competition for academic superiority, competitive grading, the curve, and the high stakes of the situation, where you could be losing a scholarship, you're competing for lucrative jobs. All of those create external motivations. And we wrote this quote up here. It was from a student note, because we just think it captured kind of almost all of this in a great way. Excessive faculty emphasis on analysis of linear thinking, causing loss of connection with feelings, personal values, and sense of self. Is that what's causing this marked decrease in happiness and increase in mental health problems? And just today, thank you to Sue Leamer, Bloom's taxonomy, right, and the affective domain, which I had never heard of. It seems very related.
And psychomotor, with the kind of connection between mind, body, and the feeling that exists in this thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Are we
right? Like we don't become brains walking around.
Yeah. Other things pointed to: excessive workload of law students, just the sheer amount of time spent. Some studies, or some articles I should say, have pointed to the Socratic method itself. Is there something about the Socratic method that causes unhappiness, whether it's anxiety from the Socratic method, whether it's a frustration of not feeling like you get to an answer? And then we have up there, is it us? Is it the law professors, right? Is it that we're either not giving feedback, not giving timely feedback, or not doing feedback well, giving it, but not giving it in a way that's helpful in terms of mental health, at least? Is it that we're trained in the law and not as educators? And there's something that comes from that creates the situation. Is it ego of law professors? Is it that we are the sages on the stage, or we're told we're supposed to be, or that's what we experience, so that's what we're doing, and we're not connecting with our students, and that lack of connection could create this situation? And like I said, it's a question mark because we don't know. We don't actually know if it's us. Could be something else. Although it starts in law school. Right? Okay, I depressed all of you more, so let's think about solutions then. And there's also a lot of articles out there about, okay, we've known about this problem for a long, long time. What are the solutions to this problem? What can we do about this problem? There's a host of them. There are articles about positive psychology, self-determination theory, mindset theory. We've heard a lot of these ideas today. A lot of the authors, I think, of some of these articles are here today. The humanizing law school movement, or balance and legal education movement, that's something that I really like, the idea of building a growth motivation from your students as opposed to a deficiency motivation, meaning really, can we find a way to have intrinsic motivation instead of extrinsic motivations? And that movement talks about how you can do that. There's an enthusiasm paradigm talking about can we build interest in our students so that it's meaningful. Everything we're doing is meaningful, and can we change the dynamic from that? I'll go on and on. Mindfulness is another that my colleague has written about and is doing studies about. There are many, many, many more solutions, possible solutions. We're going to call them the solutions toolkit. A lot of people have thought about this and suggested what we could do. So, if we've known about it since at least the 90s, we've had all these solutions proposed. The question is, why does the problem still exist? Why is it still like this? So, is it that law school culture is recalcitrant? Is it that there's a fear that we will lose academic rigor if we change things? Is there an ego to, we went through law school and we were treated this way and we became good lawyers, so it will happen again if we do the same thing, if we keep doing the same thing over and over again? Is it professors' workload? Is it the question of we have this toolkit, how are we going to implement this? I have to write over the summer, I have to develop my curriculum, I have to do all of these things. How am I going to read all these articles, synthesize them, come up with a way to make law students happier than they are, right? Or at least not make them less happy, give them more problems. Or is it the curve itself? Is there something about no matter what we do, the curve is there, and there's something that's extrinsically motivating about the curve? The essence of the curve is competition. Is that the problem? Is it the curve itself? All of those, you can also come back to, it's our responsibility as institutions to think about those things, right? What's not up there is the students. It's all institutional responsibility in terms of why it may still be a problem. Okay, still sounds like a downer, but let's get
So
less down.
now the good cop
Yes.
come in. Sorry, I didn't realize it would work out that way, did it? Okay, so we know the new standards. Yes. And I love the timing of our talk today because it really there's a lot of intersection with what other folks have said today and what we're going to propose up here, kinds of things that we're thinking about. So the core standard 302 establishes these minimum competencies, but also gives this nice little hook in here, number D, right? Other professional skills needed for competent practice and ethical practice. And some of the examples that are given that go kind of beyond the minimum competencies in the interpretation, one is collaboration, one is self-evaluation. A number of years ago, these two professors did fantastic work, and they came up with a list of like 26, which is maybe turned into 40 or something by now, of various other competencies that make for practice, that are necessary in practice. And employers agree. Employers are interested. Employers, frankly, are starting to think about compensating their associates with a competency-based model. So we're kind of getting right in line with that. And so we were thinking about the opportunity that 302 presents, and then we'll talk about an opportunity that 314 presents, to really kind of think about how can we, while giving our students the knowledge, skills, and values that we otherwise need and want them to have, how can we kind of have an intentional byproduct that affects their mental health. I put aimed at improving their mental health. I don't mean improving like we want them to be happier. We just don't want to do any harm, because that's what the studies are showing now, right? They come to law school like everybody else, and then something significant happens in the negative direction. So maybe maintaining status quo, right? That's kind of what we were thinking about. And so the idea is to craft learning outcomes using 302D as the hook to say, let's think about how they can impact mental health. So for example, one would be, graduates should demonstrate an ability to effectively use feedback to improve learning. Right? There's our very own Bloom. Our very own Professor Bloom has said, these skills are transferable. We can teach them how to do this. It's a learning outcome. It's a professional skill that's absolutely necessary to be a lawyer. Forget about a law student, right? We can teach it. We can assess it, right? Because a lot of these SLOs, we're going to draft them and we're like, okay, how are you going to measure that? Well, we can do that, right? Well, one of the assessment methods, frankly, that 315 talks about is student portfolio. So have our students create a portfolio at the end of their law school career at some other point in the curriculum and say, not kind of tell us about the work that you've done, but give us concrete examples of how you have used these tools we have taught you that we've gotten from our solutions toolkit about how to use feedback effectively. How can we teach them to be metacognitive learners? The enthusiasm paradigm talks about we need to be careful about how much feedback we give students depending on what their level of interest is at particular points across the curriculum. When they're brand new at things, before they are really interested in it, and I think the student up there said something about interest, they're not quite ready for a lot of constructive criticisms. We have to be careful. We also need to balance praise with realism, right? I recognize that's a bit of a conflict here. But all these things we can think about. And really, so the hope would be, here's the SLO, using effective feedback would then allow students to engage in the self-regulated learning process. The idea is that then increases their motivation, increases their autonomy, somehow then translates to less depression or improved mental health. Okay, so here's another example. A graduate should demonstrate the ability to work collaboratively to complete a project. We heard earlier today that millennials like to work together, right? So if we have this learning outcome, and collaboration, by the way, absolutely necessary in effective law practice, so would fit right into 302D. They value being part of a team. Can that somehow kind of harness this interest they have, create enthusiasm, and maintain mental health? Back to Liz on 314. You can just keep that.
Just gonna have to keep paying the.
Sorry.
So another kind of opportunity here from 314. So 314 does tell us, we have to use formative assessment, and not only use it, but we have to give meaningful feedback. Right? That's kind of the hammer here, meaningful feedback. So a typical student learning outcome, I think every institution must have. A graduate should demonstrate competence in legal written communication. Well, can we even back into improved mental health from that if we're giving meaningful formative assessment? So if we provide a meaningful formative assessment, and we have the solutions toolkit up there, because we need that toolkit to know how to provide meaningful formative assessment. Our colleague here has written on how to provide meaningful formative assessment. And then we also need that solutions toolkit to make sure our students are using that formative assessment in a way that will increase motivation and autonomy, using it well, and they're ready to use it. And that will create, again, that intrinsic motivation that perhaps will lead to that improved mental health, or at least not decrease in mental health. Another possible opportunity here, turning summative feedback into formative feedback. So again, if the 314 mandate is we have to give formative assessment, it has to be meaningful feedback. If that formative assessment is implemented, formative assessment is implemented as learning is developed, right? It goes, we're assessing formatively as you learn the skill. So that happens throughout 3 years of law school. If that's true, and it is, then can we take that summative assessment at the end of a semester, at the end of an entire year of law school, and have students reflect on those experiences and turn that, what would have been just summative, that final that you never look at again, turn that into a formative assessment. The question is logistically, how do we do that? If the class is over, the students are no longer in that class, how do we get students to do that? And we were talking to our colleague earlier about possible ways to do that. I think New England School of Law is doing that.
You know, one thing about that too is not just about low-performing students, because at our university, students who are on academic warning after the first semester have to go meet with all their professors, talk about what did I not do well, right? So if we somehow get everybody involved in that analysis, it's not only the low-performing students, but the high-performing students who may have otherwise thought that they were perfect. And I mean, frankly, I say that laughing, but I do think that there's a significant portion of the practice who suffers from this idea of perfection and isn't capable then of handling failure, right? So if we say, yes, you booked my class, congratulations, hallelujah, you aren't perfect, come check it out. Look, see what you did well, and see what you can do better, right? I think it's too full there. Okay, we're getting down here.
Again.
Okay, we're gonna finish up quick. One other thing, and this is just theoretically for me, the idea that I feel is incredibly inconsistent with having a mandated curve, and then the standards wanting us to believe that we see student improvement over time. Now, I fully recognize we are not using normative grades for assessment purposes, but that's beside the point. To me, it seems if we want to see students improving throughout time, I can't feel like I'm locked into a curve. How are we going to see it? Is it in bar passage rates? Is it something else? Not to mention, there is quite the synergy between criterion referenced grading, when we say, here's what competency looks like, here's what proficiency looks like, here's what emerging competence looks like, or whatever the metrics may be. So we can allow our students to say, this is exactly what you need to be achieving. And that student can see improvement over time if we use that rubric at different points across the curriculum, rather than, well, you ended up in the bottom 2% of the class, I have to give so many C's, so you got a C and you got a C again, notwithstanding any kind of improvement. Okay? So that aside, a couple of risks. Are you kicking us out? Are we done? Yes? Well, I get one more minute. Okay. Okay, so here's some risks. We do formative assessment badly. And this is our very own Professor Bloom, not the taxonomy one. The quality of feedback can positively or negatively affect self-esteem and motivation. And so I'm happy to have 314, but the question is, requiring more formative assessment, could it hurt our students more than it could help them if we do it badly or we do it at the wrong times? What if faculty doesn't get engaged with becoming educated? They don't have time or we don't have the tools. Are we engaging in the wussification of law school if we somehow think about kind of mental health as a byproduct of some of these other really meaningful things we need to do? We have a few responses to those things. On the wussification of law school, well, apparently the Hazelton study would say that the hazing version hasn't worked so well in terms of mental health. So what the heck? On the loss of academic rigor, let's not forget this is just an additional way of thinking about SLOs. We're still going to have minimum competencies. We're still going to be teaching additional skills. We're actually just trying to aim for kind of a doubling down on skills and value. Well, that's more than double. Skills, value, knowledge, and
I think
mental
intentional
health.
byproduct is the right idea.
Yeah, intentional byproduct. So we'll finish with Just the idea that our hope is that 40,000 lawyers a year do not leave the profession, that they flourish in the profession, and that they can take a minute to think about what's the thing they're going to do with this wild and precious life. So.
To increase the amount of individualized feedback within the law school classroom by the use of essay questions that are modeled on, to a large extent, the essay questions that are asked in the Michigan bar exam. And yes, we are being that crazy. We mean in big doctrinal classes, lots and lots and lots of people to take quizzes.
50, 100, yes. That's what we do. Okay, so the genesis of this project wasn't worrying about the ABA. The genesis of this project is this is how we felt. We were pulling our hair out. We were trying midterms. We were trying multiple choice. We were trying all sorts of feedback, and we thought we were pretty good teachers. And then we'd get bar results that disappointed us, and we got, even worse for my own personal ego, final exams that were really not where we wanted our students to be. And so, out of a sense of desperation, we started reading the literature, looking around, the wonderful talk on the millennial generation from Alicia and Renee this morning, and we found what Sue just referred to, Liz.
Yeah, and so here's the great thing about being last in a day filled with experts, is that this was a much thicker stack of slides when we started, and all day long we was going, But the Dunning-Kruger effect is the described phenomenon of overconfidence among those who have the least empirical basis for that confidence. That is, that when someone lacks certain rudimentary self-evaluation abilities and metacognition skills, they don't even know that they don't know, and they don't know what they don't know, and they have no idea, well, I mean, they're not going to try to learn it because they don't know it. And so we have seen effects like this among our students. As just one example, this is something that we actually overheard students saying to each other in the hall one time. And, you know, I got to admire their creativity and, yeah, okay, so
that, or I had a student walk in last year and said, I'm comparing my memo to the best memo. I see no difference. This was the worst memo in my class, and I see no difference, and I had this incredibly detailed rubric that showed things were missing, and which came back to the point that came up this morning about how the best students may well be able to use model answers because they're able to critically think about their material. But some of our students who don't have the skills, if we haven't taught them how to use those rubrics, aren't
they
able...
look at them and think they did great.
Yeah, it's there.
They do. And so we had to find a way to burst this bubble of overconfidence. We needed because it creates a bubble, and learning can't get into them through that.
And we also read in the literature, and as James reminded us this morning, learning is hard work, and multiple choice and short answer questions are not hard work. They don't require students to create the answers themselves.
And I will say it's not that they're necessarily hard work, but they're not generative in the way that essay writing is generative. They don't require the same skill set. And out of all the skills, I mean, the things we want our students to graduate being able to do, I guess we didn't think all the way up to be able to practice law the minute they walk out the door. We were thinking about writing. We want them to be able to write a cogent legal essay. That was totally where our focus was.
And of course, multiple choice and short answer don't allow us to evaluate the writing and structural problems. And so we decided, much to our own disappointment, quite frankly, and dismay, and fear, teaching classes like criminal procedure, civil procedure, property, estates, and trusts, that we were going to need a different approach.
We needed something that had, that was low stakes, as people have mentioned before, but frequent. We needed some skin in the game, but not so much that it became the source of even more unhappiness, wherever we all went. There you go.
They went to the airport.
Yeah, okay, well, more unhappiness. We needed to get the feedback to them immediately. One of the problems with any summative assessment is then you go away for 2 to 4 weeks, and by the time you come back, you don't even remember what you did or what you thought when you were doing it. We needed to do real-time correction. They needed to be more than just a little bit difficult, enough to push students to go a little farther than we had in class. I'll finish this slide up.
Yeah, we needed to have them actually write. We needed to be able to see what they were writing, and most important, this needed to be manageable for both us and the students. Students are busy. We've talked about the potential problems of overload of assessments. We needed a way that students didn't resent these and they were actually able to use them. We also needed a way that we were going to end the semester upright. And so keeping all that in mind, this is what we developed. We have slight differences, but
we decided that we had a pretty good resource. In Michigan, you may not realize this if you're not from around here, the essay questions, based on the number and the amount of time you have, they're 20-minute questions. They're not 30-minute essay questions like they are on the multi-state essay exam or a lot of other jurisdictions' essay exams. And if you want to know what the difference is between 20 and 30, well, 10 minutes may not seem like much, but it is a big difference. Take any question you like, try answering it in 20 minutes instead of 30, you will feel the push. It is a particular writing skill. It's not that it isn't applicable in other settings, but it is singular, and I don't think anyone can learn to do that competently without some express instruction. So we figured, well, we got all the old bar exam questions. Maybe that will give us a way to do some essay assessment along the way in the classroom.
so we structured these as very simple issue spotting, 20 to 30-minute essay questions. Sometimes we used an old bar exam question. Sometimes we couldn't because of the timing. We scheduled them at the beginning of the semester. Students were given advance notice of exactly when they would be. We did 6 or 7 per class. We posted them on Twin for discrete periods of time. That meant they weren't taking them in class. We could do accommodations for time and things like that. And we weren't giving up our class time. We returned them the following class. So caveat, it's much better to give them on Thursday and return them on Tuesday than schedule them on Tuesday and have to return them on Thursday. Just, you know, if you want to breathe. Low stakes, 10 to 15% of the total grade. Enough that their skin was in it so they didn't just say, who cares? Because, quite frankly, they had other demands on their time. But not so much that doing poorly would clobber them in terms of their willingness to work. And finally, we let them drop 1 to 2.
Yeah, depending on which class it is. And remember, this is the second year we've done it, so this is an evolving, this is not even a pseudo-experiment. This is just an evolving effort. Does it work? We don't know yet. Is it a good idea? We don't know yet. The students are here. We got 6 or 7 who've had to suffer through this. You can ask them what they think. We are continually taking their feedback and adjusting what we're doing. But one of the things I'm going to mention is that allowing them to drop 1 or 2 scores. It took students a little while to sort of cue into this, but it means that they sort of can decide not to take a particular quiz if they're really busy that particular week, because dropping a 0 is no different from dropping a 5. I mean, if you're dropping the 2 lowest, they really truly go away. So if you, I mean, it might feel to some like a bit of a gamble, but if you know you're too busy, then just don't take it. What the heck? And move on. And that gives them some control back over their own formative assessment plan.
Okay, so what we expected, we always go into things, it's going to be the next best thing since sliced bread.
Well,
We did expect they'd be difficult to grade, and we thought it would be a huge time suck. Difficult to write, huge time suck to grade. I mean, Crim Pro, I'm talking last semester, I had 53 students in Crim Pro, and in Civ Pro, I had 46. Started with 48, got a little lucky there. That's how sometimes you can wind up feeling. We also thought we'd have steady improvement, and we really thought, this might be my ego. I think you thought it too, so I'm going to say, that our students would really love us, because we were giving them all these opportunities to learn, and we were spending all this time grading, so they would really be happy. Well, none of this really happened the way we had it planned.
so some of the things we found, first of all, creating and grading quizzes does require significant work. Guess what? Not only does learning require work, teaching requires work. And I hate to tell everybody this, this is our belief, based on what we've been doing, there isn't an easy way to do meaningful formative assessment, to give meaningful feedback. You can give feedback that they might be able to make meaning out of, but if it's meaningful on the front end, it will require some work out of us. And that is something that's a cost we have to balance, again, against how many drinks we're going to have at the end of the day and how many articles we're going to write in the summer, or whatever that is. But we found that creating and grading quizzes was a whole lot easier than we had expected. We're looking for something, a 20-minute bite of law. We're not, actually like a 10-minute bite of law and a 10-minute bite of analysis. We're not looking for a complicated question. So if we keep the fact patterns short and develop a rubric that's pretty simple and mechanical and able to be applied mechanically, and use sort of ballpark scoring, it's just 10 points. And altogether, it's just 10% of their grade. It doesn't, you don't have to be anxious about whether you're calling every shot right. You can just rip through it. In fact, I recommend using a pen you don't like. Because if you don't like writing with it, you won't be tempted to write so many things. So ballpark scoring.
And then the rapid turnaround. So what we've given in this packet for you to take home is samples of our quizzes and rubrics, both upper level and lower level. At a conference we were at in June, the Institute's conference, we actually passed out quizzes and had everybody in the audience grade. And the remarkable thing was we did Crim Pro, and James was there, he can attest to this. Everybody's grade was the same, using within a point, even though we had professors of all different, and it was easy and quick. So
let me just stress that. We had a room full of people much like this. They all took a quiz and within 5 minutes had scored it, whether they wanted to or not. And that's right, we did 2 of them within, I think it was 5 minutes. 5 minutes for both of these individual examples. And when we surveyed the room, every one of us was within a point, and I don't know anything about criminal procedure. I just know that if the rubric says this is a rule, that's what I'm looking for in the answer. So that kind of consistency among the group, that's the, what is it, something or other, reliability, something, that thing.
Yeah, it worked. Okay, so what we learned part 2, right? First we learned it's possible to do. What we learned part 2 is the first time you do this is going to be the most negative reception. After that, it gets better. And second, that there's a difference between using these essay quizzes in first-year classes and using them in upper level, which we hadn't appreciated because we only did it in upper level last year and incorporated.
I had a lot of doubts about whether you could do it effectively in first year, and honestly, I still have concerns and questions, but we're going to see how it goes. So moving on to what we found.
Okay, so the first time around.
Our students weren't very happy about what they considered to be extra work. We kept saying, you have to learn it anyway, you have to learn it sometime. Why not learn it today? They became rather angry and frustrated with us. They resisted our feedback because they didn't want to be doing it in the first place. And so as a consequence of having burst the bubble, we found out that if you're going to give a student feedback, you're going to have to help them recover from the feedback too. And so this goes into the affective learning goals on taxonomy. So with regard to managing anxiety, dealing with time pressures, recognizing that you can be in a terrible mood and have awful things happening in your life and still do good work. I remember the day I learned that in law school, I felt like I'd been given a superpower. Like, wow, I can feel shitty and do good work. I mean, maybe that's what's happening with our affect, is that we all find out we don't have to be happy, so just do good work and be miserable.
Okay, so first we had to manage their frustrations, and we also had to create time in class. Second, we had to wait to see results. Remember that immediate, rapid improvement that we were going to see because I was going to give the feedback and the next quiz was going to be so much better because they were going to take it and incorporate it and it's going to be beautiful? Yeah, not so much.
Well,
Slowly.
hers is generally up.
No, because this 5.65 is a lying figure. I got so fed up, I got halfway through that I tossed all the quizzes out and made them redo the same quiz. This is really like Julia's.
Yes. And so what she's telling you, if you go back one more, go back to where your slide was. So the 565 counted 1, 2, 3, 4. That was the 5th quiz. And then if you look at mine, I didn't have 7. How many did you have? 7 quizzes.
Yeah, that's
Go to
right.
mine. I only had 6 quizzes, but it was the 4th quiz. About the same time in the semester, there was that point where they all said, oh, screw these quizzes. I don't like this. This is no fun. It's not helping me. And they all just went together.
Okay, so we also saw some real benefits by the end of the semester. Students realized they actually knew the stuff. So whereas in the middle of the semester, the students were not very happy with us and were walking around saying, don't take Henning for Prim Pro, you know, she has these awful quizzes and avoid Belian. That turned around.
Well, the grumpy ones graduated.
Sort of.
But we found that if you give it time and you're willing to put in the work, which is not as much as you might think at first. We've heard people say, you can't do it in large classes. We're standing here to tell you you can, and we're still standing here. And so if you give your students feedback,
We're gonna split this stuff. You wind up here with happy students, happy professors, happy everything. It just takes a while to get there.
and we'll let you know when we get there.
Okay, so we have just 2 or 3 minutes for questions. Okay.
Do you have any contracts with
You can go on
He's a contract professor, ask him.
You can go, actually, I have the answer for you. You can go to the Michigan Board of Bar Examiners. They have 2 essays per year from 2008 or 2009 to present, and every time there's a contracts question. So,
And then you can write us an email and say, oh my God, we didn't know you had Michigan was like that. Wow.
I mean, the Maryland ones, but that's.
yeah, any bar.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to say I saw this presentation last year and a very similar one. And I teach torts, and I use it in my torts class, and it was very successful. I got much better finals. I had the same exact issue with the negative reaction to it, and it did get a little crappy in the middle, but eventually I think it was a really big plus. And my colleagues who are teaching them this semester say that their midterms, they were really beautifully written, because they haven't always been, because they're used to writing nice exams all during the semester. I think that's part of it. Of course, our legal writing professors, of course, are doing an excellent job as well.
Well, and I will say, the property exams from first semester this year, it's the first time I've done quizzes in a first-year class, first semester. And I don't know whether their knowledge of the law or their sort of integration of deep analysis was particularly farther than it might otherwise have been, but they were so much better written. I graded all of the final exams in 30% less time than I have done in the previous 14 years of teaching first-year property law. And even my spouse commented on how much faster it was. And that's because they were writing it, it looked like a legal essay.
Other
Thank you
questions?
very much.
Other questions? Okay.
I was just going to ask you on the quizzes, do you think that those quizzes happen during midterms? The two that dropped, that went real low?
I don't know, students?
During moot court brief time, I mean, I decided not to do my States and Trust one during a no deadline and moot court brief.
So where it's all coming together and you have lots
Oh,
of.
yeah, for sure, like something has to give.
Well, so the averages though are the averages, well, no, I guess it would include those.
No,
taken.
I don't include, I don't put it in
Get
zero.
together on our methodology. I think I just, I don't remember what I did. But they do get very busy in the middle of the semester.
Right,
There's no doubt.
right. So
Okay, looks like we have time for one more question.
So this isn't a question, it's a testimonial. I'm taking both your classes. I'm taking Federal Jurisdiction with Professor Henning and States and Trust with Professor Belian. I do not like federal jurisdiction, but I'm learning it because I'm doing the formative assessments. And I love the States and Trusts, and having the quizzes every 2 weeks is helping me enforce what I'm learning. So,
How much
thank
were you paid to do that?
You paid quite a bit.
Okay,
We get to pick the next hair color.
So I think Nadia has some concluding remarks for the symposium.
I have to mirror Alex's comments on Professor Belian's, Professor Henning's quizzes. I credit those two 4.0s to those biweekly quizzes. So thank you for
Because they shoved everybody else out of your way, or?
Today was certainly filled with informative and interesting conversation. Before I get into a series of thank yous, I do want to mention that we're going to have this video posted on the Law Review website. And for the speakers that had presentations, if you want those to be posted on the website as well, if you could just email those to Aaron sometime this weekend or the next week, and we can put that up as well. I'd like to start off by thanking our speakers. Thank you so much for coming to our school, for agreeing to speak, coming to Detroit and talking to us today. Dean Simpson, thank you for giving opening remarks. Our moderators, thank you for moderating. You did a fantastic job. Professors Belian and Henning, special thank you to the two of you. Without the time and effort and work that you both put into this, helping Aaron and I out, it wouldn't have been the success that it was. So thank you both very much. To our symposium director, Aaron, you did a phenomenal job. I know you put in countless hours. I was getting emails at 4 a.m. from the symposium. You can rest easy tonight, and I'm sure that's the first night in a while that's going to be true. You did a fantastic job. Thank you for all your work.
And Nadia too, she was like my right-hand man the whole time, going above and beyond what she needed to do as EIC to help me with the symposium, so you have to credit her as well.
To our law review members, thank you for a year's worth of hard work. Junior members, you're not done yet. Thank you especially for your work today. It wouldn't have been a smooth day without all the effort you guys put in today. And lastly, to our guests, thank you for coming. I hope you got out of this symposium what you hoped you would get out of it, and that you get to go back to your schools now with a lot of new information, new ideas to share with your colleagues. Thank you for coming to Detroit. I hope you enjoyed your stay. Have a good evening.